Hi, good afternoon everybody. Nice to see you today. I am shortly going live with Dr. Daniella Cardenas, who is a leading consultant obstetrician and gynecologist at CRGH Great Portland Street in London. And we're going to be talking all about egg freezing this evening. So the lowdown on egg freezing, what's involved, and CRGH are kindly going to be answering all of your questions. Please comment below and ask away. That's what we're here for. And if you want to ask after, we can of course help. And then we can get going. It's nice to see everybody today. Hi, how are you doing? Hopefully tech will be on our side today. There we go. Good evening.
Hi, Louise. How are you today?
Very good, thank you. How are you?
It's lovely to meet you. I do have to say I'm a big fan of the ribbon box. I'm a fertility consultant myself.
Yes.
But I've also struggled with fertility myself. So I do think ribbon box, it's great support for everyone really going through this process, which is actually quite a roller coaster process. And I know you are in your 2-week wait, so crossing fingers, toes, everything for you, and for this to be a successful treatment for you this time around.
I was going to say it's good to keep my mind off it, but actually, you know, being in the throes of fertility all the time, you know,
it is
difficult and personally it can be challenging. But I am looking forward to talking to you today about egg freezing because I think it's such an important topic, and I have so many friends and readers that we have who have perhaps wished that they'd action steps earlier on and would love to see more education around it. So first of all, please could you introduce yourself and what you do at CRGH in Portland Street, on Great Portland Street, and then we'll go into egg freezing.
Amazing. So I'm Dr. Daniella Cardenas. I am a fertility consultant. So I did my training in Spain with the IVI group, which I don't know if you know. And then I moved to London 4 years ago. And ever since I've been at CRGH working as a fertility consultant. So
Fantastic, thank you. And I was just saying, if anyone has any questions for you whilst we're going through, please don't be shy, put them in the comments and I can read them out. It's really a great opportunity to have some wonderful expert advice. And we've done a lot of great work with CRGH, lots of articles and videos in the past and webinars, and you can go to our link in bio to find out more about the CRGH team, the clinics, and all the things that they can help you with. So please do that whilst we're talking or afterwards. So egg freezing. Who is egg freezing for or suitable for? And a burning question, when as a fertility specialist would you define it as kind of too late?
I mean, when we're talking about the egg freezing process, we do have to understand that we're basically thinking of two things at the same time. So we're thinking about quantity of how many eggs are we ideally freezing for the future, but also quality. And I think quality here is one of the main important ones, and probably it has more weight in regards to the number of eggs rather than the number of eggs that we'll be freezing. So who is it suitable for? We do know that nowadays that we have started working and that our professional lives play a major role in us women. We are delaying fertility as opposed to probably our parents when they were conceiving. They were conceiving probably very, very early on compared to us nowadays. So to be completely honest, now we're trying to postpone maternity because of professional reasons or social reasons, or we haven't found the perfect partner yet, or we're not quite sure whether we want to do or become a mother on our own. So patients are trying to start delaying that maternity. Now, what comes with that is that, especially when we turn 35 years old, our egg reserve does not only decrease, but also our quality on those eggs starts decreasing. Now, it is estimated that when we have our first period, we have already lost half of our egg reserve. And usually when we are around 37 years old, we are only left with 10% of our egg reserve. So we've already wasted 90% of our egg reserve when we're 37 years old. Now, the idea of the egg freezing, of course, it is suitable for all women really that have regular cycles. However, the advice is for women to consider it under the 35 years old. Now, why? the younger we are, not only will have more numbers for us to be able to use these eggs in the future, but as I said before, the quality of them will be better, and therefore the possibilities or probabilities of us having live birth in the future out of these eggs will be higher if we freeze these eggs early on. Now, it is estimated that when us women are under 35 years old, we are expected to have around 75% of our eggs genetically normal. But when we reach 38 years old, it's only half of them. And when we reach 40 years old, it's only 30% of them that are genetically normal. So this is why it's not impossible. But of course, as we grow older, it is more challenging for us to be able to conceive either naturally or even through IVF, because IVF is, I mean, it's not a magic wand. In the end, we do try to help women, but of course, it does have the implications of the quality of those eggs. Now, when is it too late? Probably it will be too late, of course, if the woman has already started a premenopausal period in where she doesn't have regular cycles. She's having cycles every 3-6 months, and her egg reserve is very, very low. Okay. What would
you define as a low egg reserve? Would you use AMH as a benchmark?
Yes. So we do, in conjunction, AMH and the antral follicle count, although the AMH, it tends to be more reliable. We do define the low egg reserve when an AMH is below 5, and the antral follicle count is below 5 as well. However, those patients still have, depending on their age, those patients could still be going through treatment and possibly collecting around 3 to 4 eggs at a time. Now, of course, and this will probably be a question that you'll be asking later on, how many eggs are there to save and will be ideal? And if you have such a low egg reserve, then it might take those patients lots of stimulation cycles for us to be able to save that recommended amount. But for women that basically, when we stimulate them, there's only one follicle growing, it doesn't make any sense for us to be saving these eggs at this time round, okay? Because just saving one egg at a time, it will take us lots and lots and lots of stimulation cycles. And it's not only from the financial point of view, but also from the health point of view of us injecting those women with lots of hormones, and how many cycles for them to be able to save just one egg at a time, okay?
So if someone is in that position and they do have a low follicle count and a low AMH, and they are looking at kind of 1-2 eggs, would you tend to cancel a cycle?
It depends on the position, really, and it's something that it's very tricky, because it's something that we do need to discuss with the patient, and we do need to also take into account their social situation. So are they really looking into, or are they flexible with the decision of maybe trying for a pregnancy? Because if they have 1 or 2 eggs at a time, or 1 or 2 follicles at a time, there's still some there, so we could still try even with IUI or IVF even, but creating embryos instead of eggs. Now I'll explain that why in a second. Now, so it will depend on her social circumstances. Okay, we've seen patients doing natural cycles instead, so not having any hormones at all, and just having natural cycles and collecting 1 egg at a time. However, they do need to be counseled and explain very thoroughly that, of course, that does implicate that there's no guarantees with these eggs in the future, and that she might be going through all of this for not having 100% guarantee that these eggs will work in the future, of course. But yeah.
And you're right, it is financially and emotionally draining, and it's like, at what point do we put on, or do I put on the brakes? It's like hard to know, isn't it, how far to keep going? And we see this so much in the community that it's like impossible to make these decisions and know when enough is enough and what to do next sometimes.
No,
this is why hearing from you, for example, and the team at CRGH is wonderful, because it gives us like a perspective on what's realistic and what could potentially be achievable, so that people know straight up what they're kind of looking at, to kind of manage expectations.
I think that's the most important.
Surprise.
No, I think managing expectation is one of the most important things with fertility. We do need to tell our patients where they stand and what are their chances of actually not only going through the process and being able to collect eggs, but even for the future, which I know will be part of our conversation as well, what will happen in the future with these eggs, really. So it's very, very important important. It's also important always to have counseling on board, especially for these very low egg reserve patients, to support ourselves and to support them in the decision of whether they want to pursue this further or whether there's other options as seeking pregnancy instead of just freezing and preserving fertility. Yeah.
Now, let's talk about the process of egg freezing first. What does that look like for women?
Yeah, so every clinic I'm sure has its different protocols and different ways of doing things. Here at CRGH, we do need 2 months or 2 cycles of a woman. Most of the cases, of course, it will depend on the protocol of stimulation, but most of the cases we do need 2 cycles of a woman to be able to get through with the egg freezing process. So we'll start with an initial consultation. After the initial consultation, we will ask that woman to have some screening tests done. If she hasn't had any ovarian reserve test done at that point, then we will also ask her to have an ovarian reserve test done, which basically is a pelvic scan, abdominal scan for some patients that haven't started sexual intercourse yet, and then an AMH test. Okay,
which is
with those results. Sorry, what?
A blood test.
Exactly, it's a blood test. And then we'll see that patient afterwards as well for a follow-up, discuss the results, which is probably the most important part of this whole process. As I said before, and you well said, managing expectations. With those results, we might be able to tell patients, okay, with 1 cycle, we might be able to collect this rough number of eggs. And of course, it's just an approximation, it's just a prediction. We really don't know ever how a patient is going to react to stimulation until we're actually on the stimulation cycle. But we do get a lot of a very good idea with the anti-Müllerian hormone and the antral follicle count of how many eggs are we looking like collecting in just 1 cycle. And then, of course, putting the treatment plan in place. So they will see a nurse after that follow-up consultation. That nurse will explain the timeline in regards of her cycle. We'll also explain how to use the injections. And then once she's ready, usually by day 14 of that first month, we will ask her to start some tablets. And these tablets are mainly done for 3 reasons. One of them, for patients that do not have regular cycles. So we basically can induce the bleeding, so we can start with the stimulation. But for me, most importantly, are other 2 reasons. So the first one is that us women, we select the follicle that we're going to ovulate on the following month at that point in the cycle between day 14 and day 28 of the cycle of that woman. If we have a pre-selected follicle, when we start all the stimulation hormones, then one follicle grows much more than the others. Yeah. So by giving that tablet on that part of the cycle, we're basically cancelling that signal. We don't have any pre-selected follicles, ideally, and all of them grow together. Then the third thing is that us women do create cysts from time to time, and these are called functional cysts. It's basically either a follicle that didn't grow properly and didn't ovulate, or just a follicle that continued growing after ovulation happened. Now, if we have a cyst at the beginning of the stimulation cycle, unfortunately, we cannot go ahead. So those tablets are meant to prevent those cysts from being there, okay? Now, once the patient stops those tablets, she will have a period. And with that period is that we're actually going to start the stimulation cycle, which takes us 10 to 11 days. She will come for a baseline scan between day 1 and day 3, just to make sure there's no cyst in the ovaries and that we're happy to go ahead. Then she'll start the medication on day 3, and then we will ask her to come quite often to the clinic, day 6, day 9, day 11, maybe day 12 of the cycle. And every time she comes, she will have a scan to measure each of the follicles and see how they're growing, and then do a hormonal blood test to see how she's responding to the medication, and also be able to adjust the dose of the medication. Now, usually by day 12, 13, 14 of her cycle, she should be ready for egg collection. So we give the last shot, called trigger shot, which is basically to mature the eggs inside. I'm sure you're aware of them. And then 36 to 37 hours later, we do the egg collection. Now, the way the egg collection works is a procedure that is done in theater under sedation for it not to hurt. It takes us about 10 minutes time, so it's quite straightforward. And there are some risks involved, like any other surgical procedure, but these risks are stated as less than 1%. So it's very unlikely for something to happen, but it basically includes bleeding, infection, and going with that needle through bladder or bowel, which are nearby organs. However, we do these guided by ultrasound, and we see them and we avoid them, okay? So after the egg collection is done, the patient wakes up and stays with us for about an hour, just making sure that she's drinking and eating properly and that she's not feeling dizzy from the sedation, and then she can go home. Now, the only day that we do advise our patients to take it off from work is that day, okay? That day, we'll know how many eggs we have collected. So we will tell the patient that day how many eggs we have collected. And those eggs are sent to the lab and then assess the maturity of those eggs. Now, only the mature eggs are the ones that we freeze, basically because these are the ones that we can potentially fertilize in the future. So the lab, not me, the lab will call the patients later on that day and let them know how many mature eggs we have and how many we're frozen. Okay.
Amazing. And at that point, when you've frozen the eggs, however many there are, do you give patients a statistic on the quality of the egg and how likely that is to result in a blastocyst, an embryo, a pregnancy?
So that's a very, very good question. And actually, we don't know. So the very, very problem, or the main problem with the egg freezing process, is that the egg is only one cell. We can't really assess the quality of the eggs when we freeze them. So we have to rely on the egg reserve of the patient and the age of the patient to try to assess the quality of those eggs. But really the only way to know the quality of an egg is once we put that egg to perform and we make it into an embryo and we see that embryo growing in the lab until day 5. But there's lots of uncertainties with the eggs freezing, well, when we do the egg freezing process, because we're freezing numbers there, but we really don't know how they are going to behave in the future when we want to use them. And that's the big, big problem in regards to the uncertainty and making decisions. Yeah.
Do they tend to thaw well?
Yes. So once, and this is basically moving to what will happen in the future when you want to use these eggs. Usually 70% of them survive the thaw. So not all of them will survive the thaw. Okay?
So it's actually a much lesser number than frozen embryos.
Yes. And this is the main difference when, technically speaking, when we do egg freezing versus embryo freezing. Now we have some couples or even single women that create embryos with sperm donor.
Yeah.
And then they take all these embryos to day 5 and freeze them on day 5. Now, the survival rate of an embryo once we thaw them is 95 to 98%. The eggs, though, is only 70%. And this is because the embryo is a more robust and has lots of cells. The egg is only 1. Now, we do have to take into account, though, we're counseling patients that, especially here in the UK, it becomes quite difficult in the future if you've frozen an embryo with someone and you separate from that someone to be able to use that embryo in the future. And many patients now are coming to us or me even and deciding to do split cycles. So basically do, for example, 1 cycle of egg freezing and then 1 cycle of embryo freezing. So she has both options. Yeah. Or even if she were to have a very, very high egg reserve, out of the same egg collection, we could potentially divide them and use half of eggs and half as embryos as well. Okay. But yeah, it doesn't survive as well as embryos.
I've heard of people doing that with partner's sperm as well. So for example, if the sperm quality is not great, trying to fertilize part of the eggs with that, and then also using donor sperm to fertilize other eggs to see how the embryos come out.
Oh, definitely, yeah. That's something called, well, it's not called like that, but we do use it as a trying to test the male fertility in that sense, right. or the semen sample. And then for some women, we do half and half. So we half of the eggs with the partners and half of the eggs with the donor and see how the embryos come out and what the quality of those embryos are. But yeah, it's definitely an option. Now, once we have the eggs thawed, we will then use the partner's sperm or the donor sperm, or yeah, those are the 2 options to fertilize the eggs. It is very, very important to understand that in the future, when we use these eggs, we will need to do something called ICSI in the lab. Now, ICSI stands for intracytoplasmatic sperm injection. And the main reason is that when we freeze the eggs, we basically denudate the eggs. So the eggs are covered by something called the cumulus cells. And for us to be able to assess the maturity of an egg, we need to get rid of those cumulus cells. But those cells are actually needed for a sperm to be able to get inside the egg on its own. So since we're getting rid of them, in the future, when we want to fertilize these eggs, we will need to actually choose the sperm and help the sperm get inside the egg by injecting it inside the egg. And this is what ICSI means. Now, the day following the ICSI, we will know how many embryos we have. We will grow these embryos up until day 5 and usually transfer one of these embryos back into that one. Now, and this is a very, very important concept of egg freezing. If that woman were to freeze her eggs when she's under 35, if she were to transfer those embryos at 35 or at 40 or at 45, or even when she were to become menopausal, her pregnancy rate will be the pregnancy rate of a woman under 35.
Yeah.
Because what counts is the quality of the egg and not the uterus itself. Okay. Of course, if there were to be major abnormalities in the womb that have come up throughout the years, that could potentially impact implantation. But the main reason why we're freezing these eggs is to try to have that pregnancy rate that we will have when we were under 35 later on in life. Okay. So yeah,
that makes sense. So would most people, well, most people's generalization depends on the case, but once the eggs are thawed and fertilized, then have a fresh transfer, or would they look to take those embryos to freezing and do a FAT?
It depends on the clinic, really. Okay, so if we were to have lots and lots of eggs, we could potentially decide a fresh transfer, which means preparing that woman really for what it would be a frozen embryo transfer cycle.
Yeah.
So we're preparing her for a frozen embryo transfer, but we are thawing the eggs as she prepares herself. So when she starts progesterone support, we thaw the eggs and then we grow these embryos up until day 5 and transfer one of those embryos back. And if there are more embryos, hopefully yes, then the surplus embryos, as we call them, so basically the ones that are spare, we freeze them again as blastocysts, so as embryos on day 5.
Okay.
There are some clinics that would want to make sure that we do have embryos to transfer before putting that woman under medication. Okay, so it depends really on how many eggs do we have, and are we certain that are we going to have embryos on day 5? If there were to be, for example, only 5 eggs frozen, where the statistics are not in our favor, we might advise that women then to have the embryos created first, freeze the embryos on day 5, and then put her through a medication cycle.
So with 4 or 5 eggs, for example, frozen, what would statistics look like depending on, so let's say a 38-year-old woman who has suffered endometriosis and has 4 or 5 eggs frozen, what would you tend to do in that situation in terms of
so we will definitely
fertilization?
So we will definitely postpone transfer up until we have embryos. Okay, especially given endometriosis, we will probably put her under a protocol of embryo transfer that is best suited for endometriosis patients. Okay, but we will thaw those eggs. We will hope to have 70% of them fertilized. 70% of them will survive the thaw, then depending on the semen parameters, of course, usually 70% of them fertilized. And from the embryos that we have on day 1, usually half of them make it to day 5. So with 5 eggs, we will be looking at hopefully having 1 embryo to transfer on day 5.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Interesting. Having just literally been through the process last week.
Yeah, exactly.
Again, after a 5-year break, it's strange emotions being back in it, but I am now 38, so I am that statistic, and was pleased to have had 7 eggs retrieved, of which 6 fertilized. However, at day 3 were still going, and at day 5, the 3 that were still going, 2 were front runners, but none of them have reached blastocyst. So one was a cavitating morula, and the other 2 morulas. So have had the transfer, but it's very difficult to know what to expect, because no one talks about what happens if an embryo doesn't get to blastocyst at day 5, and whether to go for fresh transfer at that stage, or whether to freeze and hope that those embryos become a blastocyst at day 6 for a FAT.
Yeah. No, definitely. I understand your situation and what you've been through, but hopefully these 2 will make it then, and crossing fingers for them to.
Have you ever seen Marula's work?
Yeah, definitely, especially if you're transferring 2, so basically trying to up the chances. So
but
we never know.
It is incredible to see kind of the differences from having done this last when I was 32 to 38. Like I knew it, you know, we're doing all the time, and as much preparation as you can do, it doesn't prepare you for the ups and downs of hearing about what, you know, each scan having a different kind of high and low on, like, oh, today there might be X growing follicles.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
the other thing I noticed being older was that my stimulation went on for a lot longer than it did previously.
Really?
So 14 days versus 10, the 2 cycles were in my early 30s. So
well, it depends really on the egg reserve. So it doesn't have really to do with the age. It's more to do with the response at that stage. But you could potentially go, well, hopefully not. Hopefully it will be a positive pregnancy test. But we've seen patients even go doing back-to-back cycles, and we see completely different outcome doing exactly the same thing in 2 different months. So it's just to do with probably that cycle, the follicles that were there at our disposal at the beginning of the cycle, the ones that were sensible to the hormones that we gave. So it does vary from cycle to cycle. But of course, as we grow older, it's not only the quantity, but also the quality that decreases. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's also getting it right. And this is where specialists come in terms of decisions, in terms of when is the right time to trigger, you know, getting those smaller follicles growing, but not ruining the bigger ones.
Exactly. It's a tricky decision. Yeah, it's a balance that we need to find most of the times. Yeah,
absolutely. We had a couple of questions, if you have time, which were just about maintaining your lifestyle. So like having sex, exercise, work whilst you're going through that stimulation process to retrieve eggs. How much of a normal lifestyle can you have? And also safety and risks involved, which you touched on before.
Yes. So, well, let's start first with the safety and risks. To be completely honest, nowadays, the side effects from the medication or the long-term impact on someone's health of the medication is completely basically negligent. So basically nothing at all. Now, of course, if a woman goes through several cycles, that it could potentially have an impact in her cycle regularity, or even it has been said in many researches years ago that if a woman has more than 10 cycles of a very conventional high dose IVF, she could potentially have a higher risk of breast cancer. So there are some things to consider, of course. We're talking about 10 cycles though, so we are not advising any women to go through 10 cycles of stimulation to do egg freezing.
Are you talking about almost consecutively, or are you talking about like a whole lifespan?
No, consecutively. Right. But of course, there are some side effects to the medication, which could potentially impact some women more than others. Okay, there is the headaches, like a premenstrual syndrome, but for about 10 to 12 days time, and you probably know about it as well. So headache, breast tenderness, feeling bloated, having constipation. There are some other patients as well. Yeah, there are some other patients as well that if they, for example, suffer from endometriosis, they might have symptoms. They might have their symptoms worsen because of the medication that we give in terms of the endometriosis symptoms. So what we tend to advise, or for example, what I tend to advise my patients that have endometriosis going through the stimulation process is giving them a tablet that basically keeps down all the estrogen levels throughout the process, and that hopefully reduces the risk of a flare-up of endometriosis as they go through the process. Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that is in terms of the safeties and side effects, etc. Now, in terms of normal day-to-day life, I think the first important thing to consider is when you decide which clinic do you want to go to, is trying to understand what is really the availability for appointments, seeing whether you can fit your day-to-day life in coming in and out of the clinic for appointments. And also whether they work on weekends or not, because sometimes by working on the weekends, you could potentially schedule things like your ovarian reserve test, etc., where you don't need to disrupt your day-to-day life in terms of work. Now, in terms of trying to avoid exercise, sex, etc., we do advise, to be completely honest, in the first month that I mentioned, once you start the tablet, to try to, you can have sex, but not unprotected sex. So basically not trying for a pregnancy throughout those tablets, because it's the safety of those tablets have not been tested with a woman being pregnant. Okay. Now, once the stimulation process starts, the patient could potentially have sex as well, always protected. up until around day 9, 10 of stimulation, which is when the ovaries start becoming very big. Okay. The risk of the ovaries becoming very big and then having sex is basically that the ovary could potentially torsion, so basically twist on themselves. And the ovaries only have one vessel feeding the ovary with blood supply. So if the ovary twists on itself, that blood supply is cut, and basically something called ovarian torsion happens. I've seen only one in my professional life, so it's very rare for it to happen, but it could potentially happen, and it could potentially endanger that woman's ovary. So sometimes those women have to have a laparoscopy and have the ovary removed. So while doing an egg freezing process, we don't want that woman to end up an ovary removed. Of course, that is the contrary to what we want. So we do advise our patients to try to take it easy as they go through stimulation. They can have exercise, so it's not a problem for them to exercise. However, I do advise not any bumping exercises, so not HIIT classes, not carrying any heavy weights, not doing, for example, burpees or things like that. So they could,
or something.
Exactly. So they could potentially go swimming up until egg collection. After egg collection, we do advise to hold on for a week. They could potentially do some cycling on a static bike, where they're basically just moving the legs, but they're not actually bouncing up and down. And the same goes for sex. Okay, so try to avoid sex between day 9 and after the period after egg collection. Now, it is very, very important, and this is something that we always tell patients very consciously, to avoid unprotected sexual intercourse as we stimulate patients for an egg freezing cycle. Because the problem for us is not them getting pregnant. I mean, we love pregnant women in the end, okay? The problem is then being pregnant with 4, 5, 6 babies at a time, because since we're stimulating these ovaries, there will be lots of eggs at the same time, as just one cycle, okay? So it's a problem of a multiple pregnancy happening. So it's not a problem. I mean, of course, you probably won't want a pregnancy if you're doing egg freezing. We don't mind, really. We love pregnant women, but we do not want a multiple pregnancy of 4, 5, 6 babies at a time.
Yeah, it makes complete sense. Thank you so much for all of this. You've been so thorough, and it's been absolutely Dr. Daniella, and I hope everyone has found it as useful as I certainly have. And people have been sending in questions which are more fertility related, around sort of embryo development and success rates from following embryo transfer and the full cycle versus egg freezing so much. But if you do have questions for the team, please do head to our link in bio and go to the CRGH website, and the team would love to help you and guide you with personalised care and a consult, so that you can talk about your individual situation to get the care that you need. So
thank you so much, Eloise, for inviting us today.
Absolutely.
And just a quick add something onto that. We do offer at CRGH mini consultations, which are 30 minutes long. It's free of charge. So if you just want to discuss your particular case, we're more than happy to, it will be with one of the consultants. So we're more than happy to talk to that person. So yeah.
It's absolutely amazing that you do that, because it does, because it gets people to start the conversation and to get some support to continue the journey and get some insight from an expert such as yourself. So what an incredible opportunity. So do head to our link in bio to book that free mini consult with the team, and they would be absolutely delighted to help. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Crossing fingers and toes and everything for you, Eloise, as well. I'll be following your history.
I appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.